it really fascinating. A lot of people are experimenting in the wellness space, but not always how else can I say this? It feels a little broy when a lot of people do it. A lot of, like, the biohacking feels super broy, but I don't get that feeling from you.
What an interesting introduction. I can relate to that feeling, and I think that's one of the reasons I feel very passionate about sharing my self-care experimentations, because I've had periods in my life long ago where I'll say I was a little more broy, and I think what that means is purely looking at scientific literature, being a little bit more removed from bodily intuition. And, for context, I grew up with two scientist parents. I grew up around science. And so it's always been a value of mine to use objective data in how I take care of my health and in how I understand the world. And so a big part of my personal philosophy is that we need that objective data. We need that grounding in science and research, but we also need to be open to and reflective upon our subjective experience and really combine those two things. So even though I do really try to use science and scientific literature to kind of base my decisions in, or at least put them into context in there. I never stop listening to my body. And with that in mind, I always invite any of my viewers to do the same. And so what might work for me might be very different than what's working or not working for the person on the other end.
I didn't know that someone could communicate the broy biohacking so like, what was missing? It's true. The intuitive piece is missing, and the bio individuality of this might work for someone, and all the studies could support it. But because of my situation, my genetics, my circumstances, my addictions, whatever it is, that doesn't work for me. And if you this is almost like you've created this new niche that I feel like is gonna continue to grow of people who are looking for the objective data. They wanna improve their wellness, but they also don't wanna ignore how they're feeling emotionally and also physically.
I'm so humbled and honored that you say that. That encapsulates my personal drive so much because I do feel like we either have thought leaders who are fully focused on the subjective and really feeling yourself. And then there's the people who are fully focused on the data. And I think the beautiful spot is in between those places. And the funny thing is, if you think about it rationally, it doesn't even make sense to apply kind of one protocol or one way of living to everyone because objectively we are different genetically, metabolically, epigenetically. Objectively, we're different. So in that sense, we also should rationally be approaching our health in different ways. And I also believe rationally that intuition, which seems like this vague thing, a lot of people and researchers believe that intuition is just our brain finding patterns, especially our subconscious brain. Our brains are amazing pattern seeking machines. So when we have an intuition that something feels right or wrong, it's not based on nothing. There's usually previous experiences and patterns that we found that lead us in the right direction. So that's why I think using and listening to our intuition is an important part of actually being strategic with our health and how we take care of ourselves.
This is a really great way to qualify because there's so much studies that show how we can be incorrect about certain things we think or the way we process the perspective we had.
Mhm.
And acknowledging that, I mean, we're going to acknowledge that. I'm very
Absolutely.
much probably leaning on the intuitive side, but I respect that there's
Mhm.
also ton of value on the scientific. And that's where I'm curious if you can kind of walk us through the journey of going from the more objective data, growing up with scientists, really valuing that. And then if there were specific moments or experiences that led you to then shift and be like, okay, I'm going to bring in a little bit more of how I feel about this.
When I was younger, I was an athlete, and then I transitioned in my late teens to early 20s to being a fashion model. And both of these, I guess, disciplines require that you are physically fit and that your body is taken care of to a certain degree. the modeling industry has improved a lot in accepting different body forms, but there was certainly a standard in my time, and I always viewed it in a very athletic sense. I wanted to be healthy, strong, muscular, and that's really when I got deep into literature. How can I take care of my body in a way that's healthy and backed by science, but also I was in a very disciplined mindset. I got so I feel like through many different experimentation steps in that time, I got farther and farther removed from my bodily intuition, and I was using a lot of information that was also either based on studies of men or being shared by men, and so many things that I did felt like it was bringing me away from what my body actually craved for balance and was wreaking havoc on my hormones. I think this is very, again, personal to me, but things like intermittent fasting or cutting down carbs, these things that are in many ways research-backed ways to live a healthy life were not working for me. And it just got to a point where I didn't feel good. I didn't feel healthy. I quit modeling and I took time to just reconnect with both my body and my mind. What did I want to do in this world? It wasn't just be in pictures. I wanted something more meaningful in my life. And I also wanted to reconnect with what felt good and healthy. And that's where I took a step back from being very, I guess, cerebral about how I was taking care of my health and just being intuitive. And I think the quitting modeling was important because I was no longer in a context where it mattered what happened to my body. And so I was able to completely not focus on how I looked, but I could just focus on how I was feeling. And that was a really important part for me to come to where I am today, where I focus on how I feel. I also use objective data and biometric trackers and things like that. But I had to kind of swing the pendulum to the other end, and then now I'm somewhere in the middle.
I know that you're speaking about 2 worlds that people listening might have never been in, which is athletic and modeling, but that transition of, "I'm doing this because I have to maintain a certain look," maybe that's self-induced, right, a lot of times, to, "I'm gonna think of how I feel a little bit," is something everyone can relate to. Everyone. It's maybe they're not getting they're not being paid based on it, but there is a lot of mental shifts that have to happen. What were some of the things, the practices that you had experimented with that you stuck with? And we're gonna add the caveat that these might not work for everyone, but, like, what has really helped you that you wanna maintain?
I'll even add another caveat, which is the things that worked for me at that moment are probably different than now, and that's why I'm a big believer in making a practice of tuning into your body and developing an intuition for what it needs, because throughout the different seasons of life, our same body is going to need so many different things. And so I think after coming from a very rigorous kind of disciplined period, what my body really craved was just relaxing a little bit more. So I started looking for more gentle ways to move my body, and walking is something that has stuck to this day. I think it's so underrated. I love it so much. As I said, incorporating more carbohydrates because it was not making me feel good to not incorporate those. Just following what I felt like my body needed and not questioning it. Because if you are in such a headspace of this is what the literature says is healthy, or this is what this person I respect says is healthy, then when you have this craving for something that might be considered not healthy or not the healthy choice, are basically wondering if you're just not being disciplined, because that's how I viewed being healthy. Health is and that's another story we hear, especially this is now over 10 years ago that I'm talking about. I feel like back then, health was considered something hard, and it's about, fighting the junk food that's in the United States, and it's about sacrificing short-term pleasures and gains for long-term gains, which is in many cases true in health, but I had to kind of let go of that mentality and just realize that health can be intuitive, health can be easy, health can be enjoyable. And so that's another shift that I still live by today. which is why I hope all my content feels very inviting, welcoming, kind of not pushy and hard.
All of the, like, clickbaity titles of, "If you're not doing this, you won't live an extra 5 years," or, like, super intense consequences if you don't follow my dogma. So, I like that you don't do that. Can I ask you for the walking? Because I think that's really interesting, even me speaking here. It's overlooked. It's not something that I would necessarily prioritize over other forms of movement that a lot of people don't. Is there any studies or research or just experimentation that you found of kind of the ideal amount or range that people incorporate?
During walking, we're using 40% of our maximum exertion, our VO2 max. And at that state, it's actually a state that has been shown to reduce our cortisol, our stress hormone, whereas many types of physical activity have a higher VO2 max and actually induce a cortisol response. And cortisol is not bad. We have different levels of cortisol throughout the day when we work out or when we wake up in the morning. But as someone who had been in such a stressed state, to then go less to running and more to walking, it was such a gift to my body. I feel like balance.
Walking is really one that has worked for you extremely well. Are there others? Because I really want to make sure we touch on the actual experimentation part because I find it fascinating how you do it. Are there other self-care experiments that you've done, whether recently or a little while ago, that really surprised you because you didn't expect it to have so much of an impact, negative or positive, that it did?
What I was recently surprised by was a magnesium experiment I did. I have this on YouTube if anyone wants to look into it, but it's essentially where I had several weeks of white pills. My mom, my sister helped me make these, where they were either magnesium glycinate, which is supposedly very good for sleep, or they were a homemade placebo pill filled with tapioca starch. So we literally removes the magnesium and put tapioca starch. And so my mom and my sister helped me create these multiple black boxes that I was taking for different weeks, not really knowing what was what, and then reflecting on how I felt each week to see, did I feel that magnesium was making a difference for me? How did that compare to the other week that maybe was a placebo, maybe was not? It was actually so enlightening to really be able to, all the circumstances were the same. Every night I was taking a white pill, but to really feel, do I feel a difference here? And I feel like through setting up this blinded placebo trial on myself, I actually learned a lot about the effects that I felt magnesium really did have in my body. And I was surprised at how clearly I could feel that effect. There was one week where I actually was completely unsure. In retrospect, I think that could have been something hormonal. I didn't take into account the menstrual cycle, which I'm now realizing instead of week by week, I probably should have done month by month. But the other weeks, I so clearly could tell what was what. And that, just the fact that I could so clearly tell, was surprising to me, that this wasn't just in my head. This magnesium glycinate is really doing something to my body before I'm sleeping and while I'm sleeping.
What were some of the effects that you felt where you saw a difference?
Really felt my muscles and body relax and kind of become heavy. And then I also have realized that with magnesium and sometimes also melatonin, my dreams are very vivid, sometimes to the point that it's almost nightmarish. It depends. But because of doing this experiment, I realized that a little bit is better for me because it doesn't get to that nightmarish state, but it can still give me that slight relaxation in the body. And those are some things that were very clear. And then when I was in the placebo week, I didn't feel that muscle relaxation, that heaviness, and I also didn't wake up with crazy dreams or have that. And so it was just very, very obvious, and I was surprised at how obvious it was.
This gives everyone a little taste of how much thought goes into what you're doing because you could have easily done it the way that a lot of people do of I'm just going to take this magnesium and see what happens. But that is again it's influenced by your thoughts because, well, if I know I'm taking it, how do I know it's really making a difference? And you've done it more clinically to your scientist background
Yeah,
of your
I
experience.
and there's nothing, I mean, this was a bit of a, the point of this wasn't to say, should you be taking magnesium? It was a fun way to show how you can be a little bit more systematic about it. But at the same time, I have a funny relationship with placebos because there's so much research on how open label placebos, when patients are told, this is a placebo, this is not real medicine, and they take it, they still see therapeutic benefits. And one of my favorite stories is from a book, The Expectation Effect. Great book. Highly recommend everyone read it. But he talks about how that the nurses were running out of morphine, so they started injecting soldiers with saline solution. And to the nurses' surprise, it seemed to really have an anesthetic effect. And then in follow-up research, they basically realized that when the human body is expecting, for example, an opioid, it can actually produce endogenous opioids in the brain. So essentially, we can just with thought drug ourselves biochemically, which is just a wild concept. So sometimes I think, the fact that placebos work and open label placebos work, even on a kind of biochemical level in our body, to me also really underlines the importance of self-care, because just the act of doing something in the name of taking care of ourselves and feeling better, that can already have a very real impact on our health and how we feel. And so I'm not, very anti-placebo, and if you are kind of haphazardly taking magnesium and it's working for you, then I think maybe that's just working for you, and that's okay.
But it's good to have that perspective because, yeah, in some ways it's so hard to get it completely objective because there is still the possibility that your body was expecting it and you reacted a certain way. But if it's having the benefit, it kind of is, well, does it matter as much what the process is for it? Is there anything you did where in the self-care experiments that you thought it would have a big impact and you were so surprised because it had a really marginal impact or not at all?
Here's what I'll say, which is maybe a hot take, because I do have so many biometric trackers, like I'm currently wearing this Aura Ring. I think these are great in the first period of using them, but what I've seen with myself time and time again, after several weeks or months of using these trackers, I then have the information I need to actually just continue to take care of myself more intuitively and not actually looking at my tracker at all. So every so often I will pay attention to my Aura Ring now because I think it's very interesting and fun. But I'm not here every morning looking at my Aura score and trying to game it, because I've looked at it enough over the course of the initial several months that I owned it to realize this is how I get a good night's sleep. This is how I feel good the next day. And once those lessons have kind of been learned with that feedback, I feel like the biometric tracking is not as helpful or even a little bit distracting. So I use these tools to help deepen my intuition about my body by getting that immediate feedback. But then I think it's not really necessary. So I wish there was some way to almost rent biometric things like rings that you could use for a little bit, but I don't need to use it forever because it's done its job. It's taught me what things feel like or what things are working for me. And now it's more of a piece of jewelry that I'm wearing than I'm instead of that I'm every morning looking at my score.
It's almost like this is a business idea for you here. You have, like, different gadgets every 3 months, you get a new one, learn the data, go
Ooh.
on. You
A
see
little
it that way.
cyclical thing, yeah, so that's my take on biometric tools. I think if they're used just for the sake of tracking and understanding, I've found that I only really need to use them in the beginning, and then I have enough information to go off of. Again, that's my personality. I like to not be bogged down with paying attention to too much numbers every morning, and I like freedom. That's very important to me, but other people might actually appreciate that continued tracking.
Well, it brings up an interesting point here because there's this phase that this is where people border from, is it helpful or has it become something I use as a crutch that I'm dependent upon, that I'm obsessed about? And I feel in the wellness world, it's very easy to go past the point of learning from the data. So, for example, your steps, I have to get 10,000 steps. Well, once you learn what that is, do you really need to keep checking it? Or with food, for example, like, a lot of people will say, well, if you don't count your food, how do you know that it's healthy? But if you never really learn what works in your body, do you really want to be doing that every single day? And I think what you're saying is an interesting part of at some point you need to use the data rather than just treating it as almost a textbook of I have to follow this and then this.
Yes. Yes, I very much agree with this, and I'll get a lot of comments again because I made this video about walking 20,000 steps a day, which some people are saying, "This is insane," or "This is so easy." It's funny how everyone has a different take on that, but a lot of people are so focused on the step count, which makes sense because that's the concept of the video, but I think I didn't drive home the bigger picture enough, which was this was a 30-day challenge I gave myself that every day I'm gonna hit 20,000 steps. Most of the time, I'm getting variable number of steps. So if I look at my annual average right now, it's probably around 17,800 or something like that. It's not at 20,000 because someday I may walk 20,000, some days I may walk 15,000 or less, and the point of that 30-day kind of structured challenge was to see what it felt like to walk that much, to start to incorporate walking even more into my lifestyle, and once I get those the kind of the basic movements of this is how it feels to walk this much, do I like it, do I not? This is what I would need to do to incorporate this into my lifestyle, then you can kind of be free to be a little bit less structured about it. That's my what I find works for me. Again, some people really like structure. My dad is a person who is so structured for his entire life, and so I think it's also personal preference, but I like to let go of that structure a bit once you've kind of learned the ropes.
It's interesting because definitely there's the personality type with it and what you prefer. And also, are you having emotional repercussions? Because if you're tracking it all the time, but you're not actually getting upset that you didn't hit the 10,000 steps, that's different from the person who's using it and every day feels worse about their body because they didn't hit it. Like there's a different response. But it made me think about too how when you were saying it wasn't every day the same, that it kind of there was a range because I'm not a wellness coach anymore, but I was for a long time and I would do food diaries, but not with how much, just like what you're having. And there would be people who used to have their cheat days, so they would have, "Oh, Saturday, I'm gonna eat everything," usually something sweet, and they would stop doing that when we were working together, and they would start looking at, "Okay, when I'm having this thing every day, it actually ended up being less than when they had it on the one final one," and so it's to your point of variation is okay, it doesn't always need to be the exact, sometimes it ends up being better for you if you allow for that.
Yeah, so I'd like to extend that concept further because earlier we were talking about using intuition in health and combining that with more objective data. I feel like, again, rationally, when we think about these things, in your example, objectively, the person was still eating less by spreading it out through the week. And for me, objectively, when I am a little more intuitive and loosey goosey, I'm less stressed, I'm happier. Of course, those things are going to have an effect on my physical body. And so the finding what also, brings you joy and feels comfortable is important just because it does make you feel less stressed and comfortable. And that is such an important part of health. Overall, I think we keep forgetting about stress and how important that can be.
You can't neglect the point of this that, okay, yes, objectively it's less, but also the way that your emotions impact your body does have an impact biochemically on your appetite, on everything. So it's not just, oh, I had less overall. It's also I didn't have some of those stress triggers that would maybe cause me to want to eat more, to not stop as soon, or, like, whatever the situation is.
And it is very tangible and objective. When we're stressed, we have greater blood sugar spikes after we eat, which can cause roller coasters of hunger and appetite, and it all fits together.
Let me ask you as a final question, what is the self-care experiment that you are most excited about? Keeping in mind this idea of making health fun, more intuitive, but also having some of the objective data.
Well, so I made a video on red light therapy, specifically masks. I'm currently looking for different full body devices for that, and I'm also currently comparing many different types of red light therapy masks, not even for the results, but for the usability of it, because red light therapy is something that you have to be using very consistently to reap any benefits. I love it because there's a lot of research to support that it does actually, reduce inflammation and help our body on a cellular level, but it also there's research to support, and what I have found through my own experimentation, it can also help improve our mood and might have cognitive benefits. So every morning I still have this ritual that I've now been doing for over 3 years, but I wear one of those masks right when I wake up as kind of a 10-minute meditation. Not only does it give me a nice feeling of I'm doing something that's healthy for my skin, because I do love skincare, I'm a skincare junkie, but I genuinely feel it figuratively and literally, it brightens my day, and I just start with such a more upbeat energy to the day and a big impact on my morning that then ripples throughout my day, and so it's something I continue to be so excited about because when I don't use it, I feel its absence.
When is that expected to go live? Because I think it's so interesting. Or is there already some videos that you have up on it?
So I do have a video on red light therapy online on my Science of Self-Care channel. There will be more to come in the future because I'm obsessed with it, and if anyone incorporates one habit, I feel like that's the one for me, again, that I just can't live without.
Thank you. I'll make sure that we include links to those videos because it's really intriguing to hear. Obviously, you've shared what you could in the time here, but you have so many experiments and videos. And if this is intriguing to anyone, you're going to want to go check out your channel. So if you just want to say how people can connect, find you.
Yes, so I would say my home is YouTube, but I'm working on reintroducing a podcast in the future and also making more short form content on, for example, Instagram. But I really love long form YouTube videos. I'm a visual person. I think the long form gives us enough time to actually engage and connect and tell a full story. So that's my home. You can find me if you type in the science of self care on YouTube. I have a bunch of videos and many more to come. It was such a pleasure to chat with you. It felt very natural and effortless.